Okay, so we're tying some cinder worm patterns today. Some very simple ones, but very effective. We're going to use some very basic materials. This is velvet tubing that was marketed by Metz. This stuff is impossible to find any longer. And it's velvet tubing worm red, and it's too bright to use out of the package. So what I typically do is either take a hank of this and bleach it with water and Clorox bleach so that I lighten the color to more like a pink or even a tan. Or alternatively, I tie the fly and then dip each finished fly into a solution of bleach and water to achieve that same pinkish, tannish color that I'm trying to replicate, which is more in keeping with the natural color of the cinder worm. So anyway, we're using that velvet tubing, and we're also using some Daiichi hooks, size 1, a little bit on the heavy side, but typically I'll use these patterns with a heavier hook later in the worm hatch season when we typically have larger fish. So therefore I would need a stronger, heavier wire with these Daiichi number 1 hooks. To be specific, it's the 2546 saltwater hook. If you can see that. All right, so we're tying to the accompaniment of the Grateful Dead, which is always helpful. Normally I'll cut off about 2 inches of this material, snip it off. It used to be that this cord, this tubing, had a cotton cord inside it that you would remove, but the latest supply of this stuff I got has no core to it. So typically what I'll do is put the head of the hook, point of the hook rather, through the tubing down about maybe 3/4 of an inch or thereabouts, and try to come out about halfway across that tubing, and so it looks kind of like that. Okay. Mount this up in the vise and pull back on the material, tie on right behind the head, and come all the way back here, maybe 3/4 of an inch or so. And then I go back forward, but I open my winds and I angle the thread bobbin so that I'm laying this thread up almost like a cord. And then go the opposite way. Again, open wraps, creating an open cord. And do it one more time. And I do this so that I've got some a good solid thread base, but also one that's a little bit bumpy, if you will, and that will readily accept and hold this liquid fusion, this urethane adhesive that I use. So I'll apply a little bit of that to the back side of the hook and flip this around and make sure I've got a little bit more on the underside of the hook. Nothing fancy about this. All we're doing is building a thread base with some glue so that I can slide this worm tubing up onto the hook and clean the fingers, squeeze the material, and really push that glue into the material, which will help hold it as this fly gets beaten up by, hopefully gets beaten up by stripers. I'll hold this on top, come back here with this thread, catch the material with the thread rather. There we go. And bind down this material, nothing fancy. It's going to be covered up by black chenille anyway. So I build a good strong binding wrap here and throw in a couple of half hitches to secure that thread. Okay. You can really whack these flies out quickly because they're so easy to tie. Then I'll just take some chenille, black chenille. I'll strip off the fuzzy end of it to expose the cord inside. Catch the cord with the thread, bring the thread forward, and wrap the chenille in tight wraps abutting one another, wrapping it forward, building this black head, which is very characteristic of the cinder worm pattern. Catch the fly, or catch the chenille with the thread, give it a couple of wraps, make sure it's bound down, let the thread hang, clip off the material, and then I go alternatively using a Mattarelli whip finisher, or I'll use my fingers, whatever. And then I just give this a whole bunch of turns and really secure that that thread, and do it another time just to make sure. Okay, so that's done. And snip off my my material. Now the tying aspect of this fly is really done. It's complete. But what I'm going to do is take it out of the vise, orient it so I can see the ventral side of this worm, and reposition the material slightly so that this fly will run straight. Now, it's also okay to twist this so that you do have a twist in here, so that when you retrieve this fly through the water, it does a natural kind of turn or split twist, which is characteristic of how these worms will swim. So I have an open end here of the tubing, and I'll just open that slightly with my bodkin. I'll take this liquid fusion, and I'll put some of this right down the throat, or the backside, if you will, of this pattern. Just fill a little urethane in there, and I squeeze it, and then I apply the excess that comes out of the worm to the surface of the worm, and continue to stroke it. I may move up a little bit, and as I do this, I'm really kind of flattening the worm. You don't want it perfectly flat like that tail, but I'll do that flattening stroke. And I'll also put a spot of this liquid fusion right on the just forward of the hook where it comes out of the material. And when that hardens up, that will give some degree of reinforcement to this material, so that with repeated stripping, and also hits by the fish, that the hook is less likely to pull out of the material if I've got that little bit of glue in there. So that's what the worm looks like. Now, what I'll do is I'll make a bunch of these and set them aside so that urethane can dry. But just for purposes of this video, my last steps in the construction of this fly is to trim off the tail end of it to make a little bit of an arrowhead, if you will. Flip it over. So I got a little bit of an arrowhead here. And with a black magic marker, I will apply some of this ink to the tail of this fly. Usually I wait for this material to dry, this glue to dry before I do this, because if I don't, then I'm actually applying glue to the tip of the Sharpie, which messes up the Sharpie. But for the purposes of this video, that's really the last step of the cinder worm pattern that can be used in its natural state of the bright orange color, or like I said earlier, I can bleach this in varying degrees so that I get a pinkish, or if you let it go even further, almost a tan color. And I'll tie this pattern in a variety of sizes. This is about the average size, about 2 inches long, but sometimes I'll tie it as long as 4, because some of these cinder worms get that long, and they can be 4 inches long. So very simple fly, very effective. SkinnyWaterCharters, ri.com.